Chazak, Chazak v'nit chazek. Welcome to Parashah Shemot on the Waypoint podcast. We have just finished the book of Genesis as of yesterday, and so today we start a whole new book. And so be strong, and may we be strengthened as we walk into the book of exile. Exodus, or Shemot, as this parashah is named, as well as the book in Hebrew. As you know, a lot of people may be familiar with the story, but we're going to do a quick overview before I hand it off to my compatriot Brad to take it over with a wonderful lesson that he's prepared for us. So let's just jump right into it. Obviously, we're talking about the oppression in Egypt right here in the first chapter. As we go into chapter 2, we meet a young Moses in the midst of all of the killings of the young children, which is a very sad story. And he is drawn up from the water by Pharaoh's daughter, which is where he gets his name, Moshe. And eventually he has a problem. He ends up growing up, learning of his past. He kills an Egyptian accidentally, and he leaves. He goes into Midian, meets a wife, and basically has a whole new life before discovering the burning bush. And then we have this. Most of our focus is actually going to be on the burning bush moment. So everything is really fire hose version of the story right up into this moment. It's a very, very important moment. We're introduced to God's holy name for the first time. Moses is receiving the biggest mission of his life, nay, the people of Israel's entire history is about to begin right here in this moment with a very big introduction between Moses and Hashem. And so they have this long conversation. It's very well drawn out. There's a lot to be gleaned from this conversation. But after this conversation, Moses goes back to Egypt. He confronts Pharaoh. And Pharaoh, of course, is not going to let it go so easily. And so after we have this sort of obvious back and forth, for Pharaoh's not going to let things go so quickly, the parashah ends right as Hashem says to Moses, "Now you will see what I'm going to do to Pharaoh. By way of a strong hand, he will let them go and and drive them out of his land." So that is the parashah in a nutshell. And now I'm going to turn it over to my compatriot Brad. He's going to give you a wonderful lesson based on this conversation, which is oh so important for this week's parashah. I hope you enjoy, and I will see you on the other side.
Hello, and allow me to personally welcome you to the Waypoint podcast. I had so many options to choose from this week's parsha, starting a new book here now in Exodus. There is a lot that happens, but as my colleague said, the biggest part of this parsha is the conversation that Moshe has with Hashem here at the event of the burning bush. Now, the instance of Moses at the burning bush is an interesting one. It's one of the first places we see sort of where we're going with the lesson. Moses sees that the bush is burning but not being consumed. He does a double take on it. And moving forward, we're going to see that there are a few more double takes that Moses has in his interaction with this burning bush. And even in that conversation, there were countless wonderful nuggets, but the one that struck me the most is the event where Moses expresses a sense of doubt in the people, right? Hashem has told Moses that he's got to go and tell the people that he has met the God of their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Moses expresses a sense of doubt as to whether or not they will believe him. And so Hashem gives Moses 3 signs by which the people will know that this is a true claim. The first 2, however, are unique. The first 2 are demonstrated to Moses there on the spot. And then the third one, Hashem just tells Moses that he can demonstrate that to the people. But the first 2 are actively materialized in front of Moses. And there's an interesting reason why, I found. So ultimately, the first sign is one that we're all familiar with because it will be enacted again in the next Parsha, where Hashem tells Moses to throw his staff to the ground and it will become a serpent. Now, why a serpent? There's probably multiple answers from multiple different biblical scholars and philosophers about why a serpent. But Ramban and also the Midrash Rabbah suggest that this is actually a hearkening back to the serpent of the garden. And the reason for this is because of slander, right? Slander is the sin that was committed by the serpent, right? The serpent is the first one to have ever done any slander. And in Genesis 3:5, the serpent slanders Hashem himself. Moses at this point has slandered the people by expressing this sense of doubt. And what we're going to find is it's actually not doubt in the people. What's happening here is Moshe is projecting his own doubt in himself and his own ability to be used by Hashem to an impossible means. And he's projecting that onto the people. So this is why the serpent, right, is it stands as a warning to Moshe of the sin that he has committed. But the question then comes, why did Hashem make Moses throw the staff to the ground before turning it into a serpent? Surely Hashem could have turned the staff into a serpent while it was in Moshe's hand. And the same point would have come across. But he first asked Moshe, what is in your hand? And Moshe goes, a stick? And so then Hashem tells him to throw it to the ground and it becomes a serpent. And again, the insecurity seems to be Moshe's own belief that he can be used as a tool to this divine end, this impossible end. Moshe, having grown up in Egypt, was fully aware of the greatness of the empire and what it would take to overthrow it. And we see already Moshe is very humble man. He doesn't think very highly of himself. He doesn't think too much of himself. So his assertion that what he's holding in his hand is a stick kind of tells us a little bit about how he views himself even in the hands of Hashem. And so Hashem makes Moses throw the staff to the ground, making Moses the one who initiates the miracle itself. This is a lesson to Moses himself that in Hashem's hands, he can be used to do something impossible. Turning an inanimate object into a living creature, this is an impossible task, and this is something that can be done with Moses' own hands at the will of Hashem. How much more so can be done with Moses himself at the will of Hashem? So this is a double lesson to Moses. Moses is being alerted to the fact that he has committed slander, and he's also being taught that his own insecurities are in fact incorrect. But the second sign, Hashem tells Moses to bring his hand into his bosom and then extend it out. And what Moses finds is that it has what is called tzara'at. It's not leprosy. It's not the leprosy that we know today anyway. Tzara'at is something completely different from what we now know as leprosy. And Seamus and I have discussed that in a number of other videos, so I won't go into too much detail into it. But this is the punishment for slander. We find out much later in the Torah in Numbers chapter 12. Miriam, Moses' sister, commits slander against Moses himself, and then she is stricken with tzara'at. So what we can determine from this, what the rabbis have determined from this, is that the punishment for slander is in fact tzara'at, because of the times that we see this carried out directly. But I find it interesting that before, again, simply turning Moshe's hand into a a disease-ridden hand, that could have been done without any interaction from Moses himself. But Hashem makes Moses pull it into his chest first before extending it out, right? And the reason for this is because, so pulling it into your bosom, this is where the heart is. And the heart is where all of the expressions of the mouth come from. Even Yeshua in Luke 6:46 tells us, right, that out of the good treasure of his heart, the good man brings forth good, and out of the evil men bring forth evil. For from the overflow of the heart, his mouth speaks. So what we say ultimately comes from the heart, and that's no different for Moses. His own insecurities were deeply seated in his heart, and that, again, he projected onto the people. But again, before it was healed, and again, Hashem could have just healed Moses' hand on the spot, but before doing that, he made Moses initiate this by again drawing it into his chest, right? Because in order to fix whatever problem is causing us to commit slander, in order to fix whatever it is that is in our heart and spilling out through our mouth, we have to search into the heart first. We have to go deep into the heart, fix the problem there before what extends forth from us will be healing rather than damaging. And so Moses had to bring his hand into his bosom once again before he could extend it out and it would be healed of the Sara'at. So the two signs that we see here were as much for Moses as they were for the people. And they each had their own lessons, and I will say lessons plural in them. One lesson being the severity of the crime that Moses had committed of slander, and then the other lesson being the ability for Moses to be used in the hands of Hashem. And then the third sign we will discuss more next week, and I'm very excited to see what Seamus comes up with pertaining to it. But this is a sign that could be demonstrated to the people and would be sufficient for the people to believe that Moses had in fact spoken with Hashem. So that's all I've got for this week. I think it's a beautiful lesson. I think it's one we should all certainly keep it at heart. That first of all, nothing is impossible with Hashem, and any of us can be used for his ultimate goodwill. But that before we can be used, our heart certainly needs to be in the right place, especially if we're at a point in life where we are prone to slander. That's something that needs to be fixed before we can be used to such an ultimate good. With that said, I will turn it back to my colleague Seamus for his final thoughts. Shalom.
Hello and welcome back. Hope you enjoyed Brad's little lesson there. And so for my final thoughts, just to kind of, my take on what Brad said, really enjoyed what he said. And I like, it sort of reminded me of a passage actually from the Rebbe, believe it or not, about introspection, right? And so this particular passage is from Moses returned to God and said, "God, why have you mistreated this people?" Now, the Rebbe is making commentary particularly on this passage, but I wanted to just really focus in on something that he says here. Is that it was not enough for the people and their relationship to God to be something that they inherited from their ancestors, like their faith. That is, he's talking about their faith, but they had to make it their own. Only when a person internalizes his faith and makes it his own can it permeate his whole being. And Moses, of all people, especially Moses even, we all need to introspect. We all need to draw into ourselves and really look and come and have a heart-to-heart with ourselves and make our faith our own before we can really allow that to permeate our whole being, which obviously in Brad's lesson is to heal his hand as well. Of any faults that we might have. And so take that and go into the week with it, understanding that Moses was human too. that everyone needs to have a moment of introspection. We are living in a time of exile, and Moses was also dealing with a time of exile. The children of Israel were in the middle of enslavement, and they too were probably in need of deep introspection, which is initially why God even comes to react to free his people in the first place. But it's something that I think we can take away from Moses particularly. We tend to look at biblical figures and think of themselves as being way better than us, that we can't possibly aspire to the kind of holiness that person was. And we diminish the human factor, that these people are still very human. David, Moshe, you name it. They all have their problems, they all have their faults, and they all had to work on themselves to make the faith their own so that they could be fruitful in exile and do the mission that God called them to do after they've made that deep introspection, so they know what their purpose is in this life that God called them to do for this place. And remember, going into the rest of this week, that you are irreplaceable. Nobody else in the world can do what you're doing, and nobody else in the world can possibly replace you. And the world could not have what's going on without your presence. No matter who you are, no matter how little you might think of yourself, no matter how big you may think of yourself, your purpose, you have a purpose in this world, absolutely. And there's nobody that could possibly do what you're doing, because nobody can be the you that you are. And so you are unique, and go into the rest of the week understanding that. And so I hope this lesson has blessed you. Thank you very much, Bradley, my compatriot, for the beautiful lesson. And have a wonderful rest of the week. And we will see you guys next week on next week's Waypoint. Shalom. Special thanks to this month's Patreon supporters: